This will be recorded moving forward, so just know if you're uncomfortable being recorded, feel free to drop off, but the session will be recorded for those who are not able to join us right now. So we'll go ahead and get started. Dave is going to kick us off, and then we'll get into the meat of this.
Yeah, so welcome everybody to AKS Office Hours. I believe this is our third one. We are your host here. My name is Dave Strabel. I work on the Azure Global Black Belt team as a cloud native architect. You can connect with me on Twitter at Dave_Strabel. And I also recently co-authored a Kubernetes best practices book.
Yeah, and my name's Kendall Roden. I'm on the same team as Dave at Microsoft, so the Cloud Native Global Black Belt team. You can connect with me on Twitter as well. I'm also a co-host on the Azure podcast, so if you're looking to learn more about our various services, we typically cover that. Did a good episode yesterday on some of the response to various service outages, so if you're interested in kind of hearing how that process is evolving, feel free to listen in. And then I also am a shadow on the Kubernetes 1.19 and now 1.20 release team for enhancements.
All right, so why AKS Office Hours? This was something we started internally within Microsoft and provided a lot of value to internal employees. And really what we wanted to do was be the same type of talk. So AKS customers, giving them updates around AKS, but also kind of the cloud native ecosystem, because it is a fast moving ecosystem. There's a lot of new projects out there. There's a lot to learn in this space because everything's kind of new. So it's to really keep our customers up to speed and also really get feedback from customers, areas they're struggling with. Also, we do host a short talk / demo also around different technologies on this call. Some of those will be Azure first party services that integrate with our service or AKS service. But others may be outside of Azure too that we see that customers are utilizing a lot, and give you kind of overviews of those different technologies. So how this call kind of runs, we will do a 5 to 10 minutes on AKS and the ecosystem updates. Today, we will have a talk on Azure Policy for AKS by Liz Kim. She is a PM in the Azure Policy team. Then we try to leave more of 20 to 30 minutes of just ask us anything. This is where you can essentially bring up any kind of discussion you want around AKS or Kubernetes in general, or the ecosystem. Keep in mind, we want to keep this interactive and two-way interaction. Sometimes that's hard on these larger calls. So just make sure that you're on mute. If you can, use the little hand in the upper top corner. There's a raise your hand button that can kind of help so we don't have a lot of people talking over each other in that. The office hours is primarily hosted by Microsoft's Global Black Belt team. What that is we have a really cool name, but we have a much smaller focus within Azure. So we have teams that are focused just on data and AI, teams that are like our team, which is focused around cloud native technologies. So we have a much smaller focus than a wide breadth of Azure technologies. All the calls will be recorded. You can go back to those recordings, send them to your colleagues. The link to that we should have probably put in here. I forgot about that, but it is aka.ms/AKS public office hours. And I'll put a link in the chat to that. And also contact us with any thoughts, ideas, questions you may have. We're totally open to feedback, whether that's good or negative feedback. Hopefully it's constructive, but feel free to reach out if you have ideas for this call, things you would like to see, just general questions. Please reach out to us. This call is for our customers to help them, so it's really your call. All right, so I will hand it over to Kendall for AKS updates.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Dave. So first, I'm just going to go into a few quick updates on the AKS service itself. Just keep in mind, we just had Ignite, and we are doing this bi-weekly, so we won't cover, a corpus of a ton of different updates, but just highlight a few that we haven't covered on previous calls. So a couple that I wanted to call out here that have basically surfaced since the last call. One is Azure Arc with enabled Kubernetes with metrics alerts. So basically, if you haven't heard, Azure Arc is basically our management plane for Kubernetes, be it running on premises in Azure or in another cloud provider. And so now we're actually able to use those metric alerts to monitor your Kubernetes cluster. So this should get you insight into things like system resources running at peak capacity, hitting failure rates. So this is in preview, so just wanted to call that out pretty briefly. Another is there's been some updates in the Windows container space, specifically around diagnostics and node auto repair. So node auto repair itself detects unhealthy Windows Server nodes in AKS now when issues are encountered. So this is GA. And the diagnostic support for Windows Server containers is in preview. So think about it in the sense that service diagnostics for AKS is already in preview. So this feature is now in preview along with that. So this will just help you get a little bit more granular insight and recommendations into the service health of your Windows containers. And then last but not least, confidential computing nodes on AKS are now in preview, or I believe, in preview, and all of the regions that have the DCS v2 nodes are actually where that's going to be available. So any GA region for those particular nodes. So I actually linked a really good article that Brendan Burns, who works on AKS at Microsoft, but also was one of the main contributors to the Kubernetes project upstream, talks kind of about the entire confidential computing landscape, why that's important, and essentially these secure enclaves that can ensure that your data in use is actually protected, so not just the data at rest. So there are kind of a couple of different approaches, be it the enclave-aware containers using the SDK and some of those other features, or the confidential containers approach, which is basically taking existing containers and adding code protection. So this is definitely something that I recommend reading more about because it's something that I think in the future will become a lot more prevalent. And then I'm going to talk through just a few ecosystem updates. So 3 that I wanted to call out here. One of them is rote graduating from CNCF, so being able to store that stateful data within the Kubernetes cluster. So this is exciting news for anyone that's leveraging this or is persisting data within their Kubernetes cluster. So be aware. There's a great update that was on the CNCF website that kind of walks through the project itself and the graduation criteria and all that it met. So recommend checking that out. Another one is KubeCon and Cloud Native Con is coming up on November 17th to the 20th, and it will be completely virtual, no surprise there. Right now, October 1st through 31st, they're actually doing the standard rate, so I think it's $75 or free if you just attend the keynote. But keep in mind that price does go up after October 31st, I think, to maybe $100. So if you want to snag your ticket, I recommend doing so now. And then last but not least, just wanted to call out an exciting update. So there's been an alpha release of the Envoy proxy for Windows containers. So I know that this is something that, if you are a Windows container fan, is probably going to be exciting for you. Definitely a big jump for enterprises that will most likely be super excited about this. So keep that in mind. And once again, actually linked a great article that talks a little bit about the work that was done and how you can actually play around with this feature. So with that being said, I do want to call this out before we jump into Liz's section on Azure Policy. We did get confirmation from Brendan Burns that he will do an Ask Me Anything for the next call. So in case we don't come back to the slide deck, just be advised that on October 22nd at 11 CST, we will have an Ask Me Anything with Brendan Burns. So feel free to come join. Send to your colleagues and bring any questions that you might have. And that information will also be posted on the GitHub page. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Liz and let her share some fun Azure policy stuff.
Thank you, Kendall. Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see the screen okay?
I can see it, yes.
Okay,
Yes,
perfect.
perfectly.
Wonderful. So hi, everyone. I'm Liz. I'm a program manager on the Azure Control Plane team. So we have ARM and governance services within our team, and I'm responsible for a service called Azure Policy. I'm super excited to walk you through the policy support for AKS today. We just went GA with this support, with this capability, and so you can use this in your production environment safely, knowing that the performance and the reliability is there for the service. So with that said, let me first walk through a brief overview, like a quick glance of Azure Policy in case there's folks on the call who's not very familiar with it. So Azure Policy essentially is a capability in which you can use to enforce and assess compliance state across your resources in the Azure environment. So you would, for example, apply a policy that says no one's allowed to deploy the resources outside of US regions. And the policy will do an enforcement where when the resource is trying to get created, if it's not allowed by policy, we will block that creation request. So the non-compliant resources won't happen to begin with. There are multiple effects that you can use. So you can use deny, you can do auto remediation, you can just do an audit, meaning that you do let it get created, but just mark it as non-compliant. So there are variations of the effects that you can leverage. And then there's also another engine for the compliance assessment, because obviously for folks on the call, you already have Azure resources. And so we will evaluate your existing resources and give a compliance report on your policy based on your policies on how much you're non-compliant, the list of resources that are compliant and non-compliant, all that sort of stuff. Policy is designed for managing at scale. Like obviously you don't really run into governance issues until there are sufficient number of resources that you need to manage. And so the way we design the service is really keeping that in mind. And so, for example, we have integration with management groups so that you can apply one policy assignment for all of the subscriptions within your tenant, including the future ones that get created will automatically be applied, will have the policy applied. We also have concepts like initiatives, which groups the policies together, as well as exemptions. And so you can exempt a particular, for example, AKS cluster from a policy, all of that. And then lastly is the remediation capability, which unfortunately isn't applicable for the Kubernetes data plane. So the pods namespaces, those don't support auto remediations yet. But for the regular Azure resources, we do have auto remediation and remediation on existing resources support through policy today. And this essentially is what it looks like when you are getting blocked by policy. This is the example of a VM create flow, where you try to create the VM and then the engineer or the VM creator will essentially get a notification saying, hey, you're blocked because of policy, and here's the 2 policies that blocked your creation request. And then here's essentially what the overview looks like in terms of the compliance report. We did have it recently updated, but this is essentially the gist of it, where you can see the overall compliance percentage, breakdowns of the non-compliant policies, non-compliant resources out of the total. Now, with that said, let's drill down into the meat of the talk, which is really the policy support for Kubernetes. And I do want to kind of differentiate between the policy support that we have on what we call the control plane resource versus what the topic of today, which is more about what we call the data plane objects. And so when you create a Kubernetes cluster, there are properties that belong to that cluster itself, right? Like a location or tags, that sort of content. And that's really, that's the support around that level of property is identical to any other Azure resources that we support, right? So the things like auto remediations or compliance report, like all of that works just like any other Azure resources. Policy supports all of these resources by default and all of its properties. And so, for example, if you want to make sure that you've deployed the right add-on onto your Kubernetes clusters, you can use policy to evaluate the compliance result, as well as to potentially also use policy to automatically deploy certain add-ons that you're looking for in that Kubernetes clusters or versions, that sort of stuff. The topic of today is more on what's happening within your Kubernetes cluster, which would be pods, namespaces, and ingresses. And so we extended the policy support to be able to monitor these objects and also to be able to show you the compliance results of these as well. And so that's really what the drill down is for this talk. And then I said policy for Kubernetes, not specifically AKS, because this applies to AKS, Azure Arc Kubernetes, and AKS Engine as well. Obviously, the experience is most streamlined for AKS to date. Being able to deploy the add-ons at scale, all of that is most streamlined for AKS. We are working on getting there for Kubernetes. We have a lot of exciting investments going into the Arc Kubernetes space as well. But essentially, just know that the functionalities that I speak today is applicable for all three types. Now let's first take a look at kind of what the experience looks like. So once you've applied the policy, this is what the compliance view will look like for a specific policy assignment. And so you can see, for example, there's a cluster that is non-compliant. In this example, it's for a Arc Kubernetes, but the experience is exactly the same, regardless of what type of Kubernetes it is. So you'll see, for example, an AKS cluster that is non-compliant. And then this is filtered to non-compliant. So you can also see it for the compliant clusters as well. You'll be able to drill down to it and then see the actual components that are non-compliant as well. So we do provide another level of drill down so that you know exactly the kinds of pods that are non-compliant. For this particular policy, what I'm doing is I'm evaluating whether it has the right image that you're trying to deploy. And so you can see here that the non-compliant type is based on the pods for each of the pods that you have in the environment. And then you can also use policy, as I mentioned earlier, on blocking the resource creation as well. And so essentially, this is what it looks like, where I'm trying to deploy a pod with a disallowed image. And you can see in here that it was denied because of this Azure policy, because you can only have a specific type of the image being deployed in your environment. And so when you apply the policy, by default, users will not be able to take actions that are non-compliant. And you can also do an audit as well. So when you're rolling out a new policy, our recommendation always is to first roll it out as an audit, meaning that we won't do this real-time enforcement. We won't block your resource creation, but we will give you a compliance results on your existing resources so that you have an idea of the impact of the policy, as well as the kind of the list of the non-compliant items that you currently have, and then switch over to a deny policy. And then just a brief overview of kind of like how it works underneath the cover, right? And I really share this so that really it's two things that I want to share. One is that we do use OPA and Gatekeeper underneath the cover. And so there's an OPA and Gatekeeper already deployed on your AKS underlay, so that essentially what we are doing is we are pushing in the Regu policies into the OPA engine, and OPA is actually what's doing the enforcement. And then we will get back the compliance result and have it reported back out to the Azure Policy Service. And so at the end of the day, you're able to have a centralized place where you push down the policies across all of your AKS clusters, right? So you apply one policy across your AKS clusters. You have a central place to also view all of the compliance results as well. But there is a dependency that for one, we are using the OpenID Gatekeeper, and you'll be able to see that in kind of when I walk you through the policy language itself as well. And then there is a policy add-on that you need to install as well. And so you have to have the Azure Policy add-on in each of the AKS cluster. And as I touched on earlier, obviously you can use policy to make sure you have this add-on installed across all of your AKS clusters. But that is a prerequisite in being able to use this capability. Now let's drill down into the policy definition and how it looks like. So when you go to the policy experience, there are quite a few what we call built-in definitions today that you'll be able to see. So when you go to the policy definitions and filter down to Kubernetes, there's all of these policy definitions that we already shipped out for you to be able to manage your AKS clusters. And if I drill down into one of the definition, this is an example that I have for allow container images. And just a few things. So first of all, you can see that I have a parameter in place, right? So obviously, each of the requirements for the customers are going to be different. And so we do support parameters so that it can be customized based on your need. And then you can see it on the effect section that we support audit, deny, and disabled. I touched on audit and deny earlier. Disabled just means that you're turning off the policy. You may find it useful if, for example, if you're using an initiative definition where you group these policies together and you just want to turn off certain policies within that initiative, you can use the disabled effect for that. And then we support exclusions based on namespace names. And so if there are specific namespaces that needs to be exempted, you can add additional values in there so that they are not applied to policy. And then the policy rule itself is actually quite straightforward. And so it's just an if and then statement. And if essentially shows what we're targeting, right? So you can see here that one policy definition is able to target type of AKS engine, as well as the Kubernetes, the Azure Arc Kubernetes and AKS. So you can see that one is able to target all types. And then you would and then the Rego policies are actually on a public GitHub link. So I will drill down into each of these items as well, but essentially these are the files where, as you saw earlier, that we are actually pushing it down to the AKS underlay. So what the add-on will do is, what the Azure Policy add-on will do is, it will take these policy definitions and push it down to your underlay to be enforced and to use it for a compliance state assessment. And this public GitHub URL link, essentially, when you drill down into it, when you link it out, it will have the Rego policies that some of you may be familiar with. So this has the actual violation message that you want to use and the rule that you're trying to apply. And then the other link that you saw earlier, so there were two links. So this is the template, and then the other constraint link that you saw earlier will essentially show you the type that we're targeting. So you can see here that we are trying to target the pods, and then it has a parameter for the image regex, and then the excluded namespaces. So the list of the namespaces that we will be excluding. And so this is essentially the pattern that you'll see for all of the Kubernetes policies, where we have a simple if and then statement, and then the actual Rego policies are out on a public GitHub URL.
Also, Liz, you have some questions in the chat. Would you want to do those as we go, or do you just want to save those for the end? Just want to make sure that we don't miss those questions.
I'll just quickly take a few. So it says, can policies be different for AKS and ARC-enabled AKS? So you can separate them out. So you can choose to have one for AKS and another one for ARC-enabled AKS. And it's pretty straightforward because it's just an if rule that would be different. Or you can just choose to have them together. Only the Kubernetes policy go through a gatekeeper? Yes. So only the ones that the policy service put in will be applied to the gatekeeper. if you try to go in there and put in the other regular policies directly, policy service will periodically override it as well. I think there's one for PSP that they've already responded that PSP will be deprecated and that it will be replaced with the Azure policy. And so if you go to the policy service today, you will see 2 different initiatives that we put in with these PSP policies. And we are still working on growing that list. And the plan is that it will be replaced with the Azure policy capability. Now, let me just quickly go through kind of what the experience will look like for you to get started on this capability. So when you go to the policy service, as I mentioned earlier, we do have quite a few definitions already available. And so let me just show you for the Kubernetes. You can see here we have the 2 initiatives that I mentioned earlier, as well as the individual policy definitions. And each of these essentially definition alone won't do anything. It's just there in your environment. You need to actually assign these definitions for it to impact your environment. So let's say that you want to make sure that there's no, you're not allowing any privileged containers in your environment. You can take any of these definitions, assign it to a given scope, and scope is essentially your management group, your subscriptions, your resource group, or if you're doing it through API, PowerShell, CLI, you can also do it for a specific resource as well. And so you provide the scope in which you want to impact. And then you can see the policy enforcement enabled, disabled. What this means is if you need to temporarily disable the assignment so that it's not blocking your pods creations, right? It will essentially do that. So this policy enforcement property is essentially stopping any enforcement that we are doing at the time of resource creation. Parameters were applicable, and then this won't be applicable for the Kubernetes policies. And then lastly, you would be doing the review and create. So it's very straightforward and simple for you to get started. One thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, is that you do need to have the AKS add-on for each of these clusters. And we do have a policy definition available for you to actually deploy these add-ons. But if you want to go ahead and just test it out manually for each of your Kubernetes clusters, if you go to the Kubernetes service experience and go to the policies, you can see here there's a simple button that you can enable to actually enable the AKS add-on for Azure Policy. I'm not quite sure what happened. To refresh. I'll troubleshoot after the call. But yeah, so it should be working. If there's an issue, I will double click into it. But essentially within each of the Kubernetes cluster, you can enable the add-on so that you can test it for one cluster at a time if that's what you're looking for. Now with that, let me close it with some of the roadmap items, and then I will visit the questions that's on the chat. And so first of all, the Azure Policy for AKS only supports built-in policy definitions today. We do have plans on supporting custom policy definitions, and we would love to get your feedback on this. And so there's a survey link that I put in here, and it's super quick. I think they're all mostly multiple choice, if I recall. It's designed so that end-to-end you can fill this out in 2 minutes. And we would really love your feedback as we design out our path for the custom policy support. And so it's aka.ms/AKS policy survey 2. And essentially for custom policy support, right now we are actually able to have you join the private preview where we will enable it for your tenant to be able to leverage the custom policy. So it's not really a technical limitations that we are having on custom policy support. The reason why we haven't put it out for broader public use is because Our concern is that not everyone may be familiar with authoring Rego policies. And so we want to be able to have a better tooling around authoring the Rego policies before we make this broadly available for all policy customers. And so our ask is, if you need custom policy support today, we can enable it for your tenant, but you have to have experience or have certain knowledge over authoring Rego policies. Otherwise, we ask that you wait until we have some investments going into, for example, the VS Code extensions for authoring Rego and being able to do what-if testing. Like, we do want to have that capabilities available prior to enabling it broadly. And then secondly, we are working on having the CRD templates, the Rego policies that you saw earlier, to not be in a public GitHub URL. And so we completely understand that it may be fine for built-ins, but at least for custom definitions, you may not want to put it out on a public GitHub URL, or you might not want to have an endpoint exposed to a public GitHub URL. And so we are working on essentially ability for you to have it on either put it onto your own GitOps, and the policy add-on will fetch the Rego policies from GitOps. And another option will be having it embedded, and so that it's within one policy definitions that you put out. We are not going anywhere to fetch it, just in a single policy definition. It has that if-then statement that you saw earlier, as well as all of the content for the Rego policies. And so that you can have one thing that you're touching and deploying at the end of the day. And so that's kind of the immediate roadmap items. There's a few other work going on, such as we are working on increasing the number of non-compliant pods that you can have in your clusters, all of that stuff. But essentially, that's kind of where our current investment lies. With that, let me go through some of the questions. Maybe integrate with VS Code extension for OPA. Yes, so we are looking into that, and that is one of the things that we may take dependency on or contribute into. PSP in Kubernetes will be deprecated, question mark? Yes, so the plan is that the PSP for Kubernetes will be deprecated and will be replaced by Azure Policy for Kubernetes. And then, well, one more thing before I forget is, obviously, because it's a part of a service capability, we are also working on having the Azure Policy support for AKS in other clouds as well. So we are also working on having it supported in national clouds, which was not previously supported by PSP. Create custom policy. I'm assuming this was touched before I went over the roadmap. Let me know if you still have questions around the custom policy. The gatekeeper gets installed when enabling the policy add-on. Just enable the add-on and set your policies when you're done. Yep. Can policies be different for AKS? I think I touched that earlier. There's a CLI command that can list all security policies that are available for the cluster. That I'm not sure. Alfredo, let me get back to you on it. Let me look into it and see if there's a CLI command for it. And then there's any type of audit tool for AKS security policies. I think this was touched on with the PSP. When do I still have to use pod security policy? Is there more granular support I can obtain from PSP? You don't get any more granular support, but PSP did allow you to have custom policies. And so if there were custom policies that you were leveraging, then that's something that you will be missing when you re-platform onto Azure Policy. And as I touched on earlier, we are taking feedback on some of the built-in definitions. And so if there are certain policy definitions that you're looking for to be part of the built-ins, please do let us know. We are more than happy to investigate. And I think that was it for the questions. I'm just quickly going through the ones with the question marks on it. How is Azure Arc different from AKS integration with Azure Monitor on the Insights tab? Dave, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to bring something else up about that kind of goes into this kind of whole thing around Azure policy. One of the things a lot of our customers are asking around Azure or around Kubernetes policy there is it's great because that can protect against, essentially somebody running kubectl and you can set a policy. But one of the things they want to get that feedback into their developers or whoever, deployment engineers, whoever's, creating those different Kubernetes manifest or Helm charts and that. So there is one way you can do this. The nice thing, since we do use just the open source OPA/Gatekeeper, there's a tool called ConfTest that a lot of my customers have started using, where you can bring policies, these Rego policies for OPA, into your CI pipeline. So in your CI pipeline, whether you're using something like Azure DevOps or Jenkins, you can have a step in there that runs ConfTest against a set of policies. So then you get feedback earlier before you actually do that deployment. It's nice because it's more enabling to developers to get them to do the right thing. A lot of times when people hear policy, they get the pitchforks out and think you're restricting them. I see it more as an enabler for developers to do the right things because there's so many different options of how you do a deployment in Kubernetes and all the different options you set in there. It's nice to be able, for example, when Kubernetes went from like 1.15 to 1.16, it deprecated some major APIs that many customers were still using. They were very old, but what happens is somebody goes out there and they typically do a copy and paste of some, deployment manifest. It's using an old API version, works on 1.15, doesn't work on 1.16. So if you can move those policies also into your CI pipeline, you can get feedback to your developers much sooner, and it can give them like a actual, like, here's what you need to do. Like, you need to change the API version in this. So definitely check out ConfTest. I'll put a link to it just in the notes here. And I've also written a blog post on our Azure Global Black Belt blog on how to use ConfTest with some sample policies in there.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave, for sharing that. I think I'll actually take a look at myself as well. Great. I think that was it in terms of the content that I wanted to walk you through. I will go ahead and start typing out and responding on some of the chats directly as well. Thank you for the opportunity to walk you through the AKS policies. Let me know if you have any questions. Please feel free to directly reach out for any questions you have, or if you want to also just have one-on-ones on going through some of the content, I'll be more than happy to do so as well. Thank you.
All right. Since there's no more questions for Liz, I will open it up to the Ask Us Anything. On this call, we have a lot of people, different people from within Microsoft and outside of Microsoft. So we have a lot of people to answer questions for you. So I will open it up to that. If you want to come off mute, feel free to. If you rather put those in the chat window, you can also do that.
Hey, my name is Raj Krishnamurthy. Liz, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. The question I have is that, see, OPA has a steep learning curve, right? And is Microsoft planning to only support OPA, or are you planning to support any, is there going to be a policy controller that you would support? Because ultimately what OPA does is to be able to take input formats, do comparisons, and provide a response, right? that could be either inline integrated into the controllers or out of band, like he pointed out as comp test or other tools, right? So are you planning to only support OPA or are there going to be other options as well? Custom options as well.
Liz, are you still on? And did you hear that question?
Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was a question for me to answer or not, because we're only leveraging OPA for really selectively for policy capability that we needed for Azure Policy. I'm not familiar with plans on the AKS team to support OPA across for all of its functionality.
No, just to be clear, my question is not across the board. My question is very particularly specific to Kubernetes.
Right, for AKS at the end of the day, yeah. But I'm not familiar with any plans or investments going into it.
Okay.
Yeah, and Raj, I believe your question was more, will you support kind of other frameworks outside of just OPA because of the learning curve of something like Rego?
That is right. And sometimes OPA is unnecessarily complex, right? When you're writing a few policies, it may be okay. When you're going to drop into production, there are going to be hundreds and thousands of policies. It makes it extremely difficult to manage.
Gotcha. So I am hoping that with the integration with policy that we will revisit on some of these items. I think, like, for example, investments that we're looking to make into authoring tools, I think is a part of that story of being able to author and do what-if testing more easily. We are looking into kind of the usability of the regular language as well. And so you may see it in the questionnaires in the survey of us asking, like, hey, like, how difficult was it? Like, is it for you to understand what's the readability of the policy like? Or how was it like for you to author a rego? So we are drilling down into the customer experience side of the story. In terms of deployment, I think in terms of the deployment of these policies, I think that story ties into just like any other Azure policies today. And so we have an integration with, for example, being able to export out any of the definitions you've created into your GitHub repo. We have some GitHub actions and DevOps actions available for you to use CI/CD pipelines for deploying it. And then we have investments happening right now for safe deployment story of these policies as well. And so I'm hoping that with the investments that we are putting into the lifecycle story of overall Azure policy, that it will become easier for you to manage and govern these.
Yeah, and I'd also just like to add, also, like, I totally get your point on Rego can have a learning curve to it. I think there's a lot of benefit in learning Rego because it can apply to a lot of different things and just not Kubernetes, where there are other frameworks out there for policy that do some of the same stuff that Gatekeeper does, but it's very specific to Kubernetes. Also, the OPA project is looking to expand out the library. So they've started integrating with OCI registries. So think of now policies becoming something like you do with Helm. Like Helm can be very complex too, but we have thousands of Helm charts out there that make Helm much easier to get a package. So look like forward to seeing things like having like a OPA policy registry where I may have hundreds of policies in there. So there's a lot, it'll become a lot less dependent on me building a bunch of custom policies. If you need that level of like building those custom policies, I think there is value in learning it, but you always have the choice to use another policy. If you're just focused on Kubernetes, maybe one of those other policy frameworks are easier and you can deploy that to AKS or any other cluster. But I think what you'll see going forward with OPA is it'll be easier to consume policies. And a lot of these policies apply throughout a customer base. Like we see a lot in like certain verticals like financial services where tons of these policies, they're the same across these customers. But very much sympathize with you saying Rego can be kind of a pain to learn.
Thank you. I appreciate the answers.
I have a question. My name is Alberto. I have a question around governance, since you just brought it up. I threw a question in the chat around Microsoft integrating with like existing container security tools, just because of the fact that like I'm using Prisma Compute and it has the same OPA policies that Azure is providing currently. So one of my concerns is competing priorities, like my cloud team setting up the policies for AKS, and then my security team setting it the same AKS policies at the container security tool layer, right? So are there any plans to integrate the two or have visibility into which one would take precedence over the other?
So I think in terms of the precedence, it will depend on what they're leveraging underneath what the third-party companies are leveraging underneath the cover. If they're trying to update it directly, as I touched on earlier, if they're trying to update it directly onto the gatekeeper and OPA, then it will get overridden by the policy service on your AKS cluster. So I believe you're running that check every 10 to 15 minutes. We've documented the exact time, but we will override what they're trying to put in place. And I think another aspect of that is, we always say that governance is, like 80% of governance happens in meetings. And so ultimately, the teams will need to collaborate together and have plans on which team will be responsible for putting in these security policies. And it may be from the security team, and that's perfectly good. These policies I just walked you through today, by the way, also has full integration with Azure Security Center as well. So if that's the experience that they're familiar with on applying the recommendations, viewing the result, exempting resources, all of that is fully integrated. And so I think at the end of the two teams will just need to work together, because otherwise you will get unexpected result on your for the security team. If they're using third party, you will get unexpected result because they will keep getting overridden.
Got it. Thank you.
And it looks like there's another question in the chat. I'm not sure if Azure RBAC is already supported on version 1.19. I'm guessing you're talking about the new RBAC feature that's in preview, the Azure RBAC for Kubernetes authorization, where you leverage your integrated authentication between Azure Active Directory and AKS. I believe that there should be no changes in 1.19 that would not make that work. The one thing you do have to make sure when you do use this is you have to use a kubectl version of at least 1.18.4, I believe, or higher. Otherwise, you will get weird errors when your user tries to authenticate if you're using that feature.
Hello, this is Srinivas. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So Dave, maybe you already touched upon this indirectly. I quite didn't understand all of it, like when we were talking about, policies in CI pipeline and testing upfront to give you the, the feel of what the policy would do before we actually deploy it. Along the same lines, I was wondering, is there a good way to audit clusters out there which have been deployed that are not on supported versions of Kubernetes? Is there like a built-in policy that would be rolled out to check that kind of a functionality?
Yeah, so clusters on unsupported versions, I believe we do now. If you go into Azure Advisor, there is now integration Azure Advisor for AKS. So you do have a listed there. It should list out what versions are on unsupported versions of AKS. So if you're like on a version of like 1.14, that should show up in Azure Advisor. Because there was a few new tabs added to like, or a few new integrations added to AKS, I'd say over the last few months around diagnostics and Azure Advisor. And there's more information getting put into those all the time. But under Azure Advisor, I believe you should be able to see unsupported versions that you have deployed in Azure. On the policy standpoint, I will put a link to a blog I wrote that kind of covers what you can do with that, with ConfTest. But essentially, I get direct earlier feedback from those policies. I may have those same policies live in my cluster. That protects me against somebody going to run kubectl, apply this manifest. But if I can move that into earlier feedback to my developers and have them do the right thing, or if they're deployment engineers, whoever's building those CI pipelines, when a developer pushes a commit, and it goes through the CI system, I then get direct feedback to say, hey, I have like a old deprecated version of a Kubernetes API, or hey, I don't have my request and limit set, and it will then give them feedback of what to do, because you can set custom messages in that policy to say, hey, you have to set resource and request. And it could be even setting a link to your wiki or your SharePoint, one of those things on guidance on what they need to do. It just gets that feedback earlier to them, so they can do kind of the right thing when they're doing deployments.
Sure. Thank you.
Hi, this is Manny here. I have a question on what's the strategy to update system images like Hypercube, Calico, Periscope, etc., some of which are supposed to be managed services. Like, do those get upgraded only during a cluster upgrade, or would they be upgraded within the same cluster version from time to time? Because some of the security scanning tools list images hosted in mcr.microsoft.com as vulnerable, and we are not sure if we should update them on our own, or if we should wait for Microsoft to update them.
Yeah, those are updated by Microsoft. So if you go in our public GitHub repo for AKS, under releases, it will say when a new release is going out and what components are being updated there. Because essentially what we store in MCR is so customers can point to a Microsoft endpoint, but we're still using the same Hypercube and all those components from upstream. But in that, I will set a link to that repo also. But in that repo, it will tell you anytime a new release is going out and what all those components are being updated. And it will give you any guidance on if you need to update to a new version of Kubernetes to get a specific update, because there are some that roll out without you having to go through a full Kubernetes version upgrade.
And these are also listed in the releases page in the GitHub repo?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And for those of you new to the call, also in this repo that I will post here, under projects, you will find our full roadmap there for AKS. So it is a nice repo to go and look at because all our releases are in there, detailed information. Even in the release notes, we do put like kind of notices if there's like could be breaking changes in the Kubernetes API, any changes to like our default runtime. For instance, with Kubernetes version 1.19, we will be defaulting to containerd rather than using the upstream Docker version of Moby. So definitely keep an eye on that. And like I said, our roadmap is there, both for public and Azure government. There's a lot of details in there. And also, if you want to interact, if you have issues, suggestions, feature requests, I'd always say also use the issues within that repo because our product team does monitor this daily. All right, we have 2 minutes left. Anybody with one last question?
I have a question about the network mode transparent for Calico Enterprise. Is it still in preview or is it already like GA?
Was a specific feature you asked for Calico or just Calico in general?
So when we want to install Calico Enterprise, we have in the network profile of the AKS cluster, we have to set the network mode to transparent. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I believe it's still in preview and should be GA. If you want to send me your email to that AKS office hours, I can check for you also on what the status is. But I believe it's still in preview. It should be coming GA in the next month or two.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll send you an email. Thanks.
All right, so we're at the end of the call. Thank you everybody for joining. Again, the next one will be October 22nd, and this one will be a Ask Me Anything with Brendan Burns. So bring all your questions. It should be very informational. So we will see you all next time. As always, please provide any feedback you have on these calls. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.